Hello, Bo, and welcome. Just send this out. URL. Hello, Alexis. Welcome, welcome. Just a quick note for everybody, two guys that are here. You are muted by default, so it helps when people join and they got like the background noise. So if you want to say anything, feel free to, but just know that you're muted by default when you join. And we'll get started here in a minute. I usually like to give everybody 5 minutes to get started, to like drum in and stuff like that. But if it ends up only being you two, then that just means we have 2 awesome C# people, or people who want to learn C#. So it's never a bad thing. So. And just to give you a little idea of what we're going to go over today. So I have a little tiny itty bitty C# app, and I'm going to take you from kind of conception to reality of how it works. Okay. Just a really basic walkthrough of the different pieces you'll have in a C# backend API. So we won't be going over things like loops and basics, that kind of thing. We'll be actually touching on how the API comes together and how you do that, and what pieces you need to kind of get that together. So we won't be necessarily following a lesson exactly, but this will be knowledge you can apply in a lot of different ways. So hopefully it helps out. And we'll just give it another two minutes or so. We won't be waiting for too much longer. Just want to make sure there's enough time before we start that people can drum in if they want. But I suppose it is a Friday night. So, people, Friday night might be a hard ask. And these are recorded. So if you have to step out before the end or something like that, just know that they are recorded and they'll be available up on our Vimeo tonight or tomorrow or something like that. So it all depends on how quickly Vimeo processes everything and how quickly the recording gets processed through Zoom and stuff like that. So, but I do make a point to put them up there when I can. So, but hopefully you guys are doing okay tonight. I appreciate you guys coming out to the workshop for sure. guys and or gals. Let me go ahead and start sharing my screen here. Screen share. Move you over here. Okay. This project is not up in GitHub. This is kind of a modified little project of mine. I probably will not put it up on GitHub because it is connected to a database and it will require a database connection to work correctly. But the same basic concepts can be applied without a database. So let me just open up the workshops channel. For those of you who have not been privy to the workshop channel yet, this is how you join, okay? So if you go up to channels right here, so it says browse all channels, right? So you click that. You go to workshops and you can just click on in there and that'll join you in the workshops channel. You don't have to be invited or anything like that. You can join right away. And sometimes if the workshop is slightly more interactive, you can go ahead and we can post stuff in here, you know, chat it up in here. All the workshop announcements will be in here. So if you're not part of the announcements or you don't really care about announcements in full stack, you can come here and this will get you workshop announcements. So good channel to be part of for workshops if you enjoy the workshops. But without further ado here, we can go ahead and get started. If you guys have questions or anything, you're more than welcome to post them up in the chat here. Let me open up chat. You're more than welcome to post them up in the chat inside of Zoom or in Slack or what have you, or you are more than welcome to unmute and ask as we go through. But like I said, this is going to be a short little one, just kind of stepping through the basics of a C#.NET core backend, okay? So the base of a .NET Core backend on the simplest level is going to be a controller. So you can actually have controllers without models, but the two are tied directly, and we'll go over that in a second. But at the most basic level, you have a controller. Okay, and you can think of a controller as your business logic / your routing. In a .NET Core project, your controllers also do your routing. So, so here we have a home controller, okay? And all this home controller has is a /hello HTTP GET route, okay? So we're basically defining one route on the home controller that is available at the URL, localhost, whatever, /hello, okay? And then the method within this class, so a controller is, you know, a class that derives from the controller base class, okay? And the method, each method inside of here can be a route. So I don't have a constructor, I don't have anything like that in here. I literally just have a method that returns a response. So in an MVC, you know, ASP.NET MVC controller, anything you return from a route handler is what's returned in the response, okay? And notice that I'm doing public string, so it expects a string to be returned from this route. And then you can name it whatever you like. The method name usually doesn't have anything to do with the routing. It's whatever you want to name it, okay? And then its return, here I'm returning just a string, but notice the type has to match. So I say here, hey, I'm returning a string, and then I return a string, but then that string is converted into the response that's returned to the browser when it requests, or to React, or to wherever is requesting, whatever is requesting this, it will end up sending as, this will be the response in that request. So, so once we define a basic controller, we can actually test our app from this point. So this is the way the basic controller looks. If you do create a starter project, and I apologize, we won't go through that this time around, but But when you create like a starter project, the curriculum has some things as far as doing that. But you will get a couple of, I believe you will get 2 controllers and then I think a model. But you can start it right then and there. All of your stuff will be given to you. So I have a program.cs, I have a startup.cs, and both of those were provided for me. So I didn't make those. So, but those are required, and those you'll get those. So basically what I'm saying is when you start working on a .NET Core, MVC project, you probably won't be creating a lot of these files yourself. You'll have some of these already given to you, and you can kind of just work from there. Okay. But what I want to do is kind of test this controller here. So the idea is that we make something, we put it in there, and then we kind of test it. So the way we do that is if we've set up everything correctly in Visual Studio Code, we can actually just press F5 and kind of go from there. Okay. So go. I'm just trying to get some of these to go away. So let me close this. Close this. Let me just close that for right now. All right, so it doesn't want to cooperate. That's okay. So when I press F5, it'll basically do a .NET run for me, more or less, and that'll fire it up. So let me see here. So let me close that down and bring over this. Sorry, a little bit disorganized today, but we'll get the point across. So sometimes when you see this, you start to panic, right? Like, what did I do wrong? But we have to also remember that the API only has the routes we defined. And if we don't define a route that's just at, the root URL, then we will get a 404. Like, that's the expected behavior because we haven't defined a route on the 404. Or I'm sorry, we haven't defined a route on the root, okay? So we haven't defined anything to happen when we go to nothing, right? So if we just fire up localhost 5001 and we haven't defined anything at, just the basic /, then of course we're going to get a 404 because we haven't defined anything that should be responded when we go there. But if we go to /hello, okay, we end up with hello from .NET Core, okay? And if we go back to our code, all right, and we look at what we're returning as the response, then we get that. So we've successfully tested that route, okay? So notice we're sending back hello from .NET Core, and we've defined that as an HTTP GET /hello. So it's not at /, but just to kind of give you a visual cue of what it'll look like when we do define something, and just to kind of prove that the logic behind the 404 we just got makes sense, we can change this to /, okay? We can run it, all right? And then we do get hello from .NET Core when we don't have anything else on the route. Now, when we go to /hello, we get a 404 because we no longer have a /hello. So, so whenever you get a 404, in anything you do, just make sure that you check your routing and make sure that you've defined a route for that. Because if you haven't, a 404 is the expected behavior. So, and usually that's with a lot of different frameworks and languages and stuff like that. A lot of different frameworks have that. But that's the basic of how a controller works, okay? So a controller is basically just your routing plus some business logic if you need it in there. Now, obviously, our APIs are not just going to be a bundle of controllers that give you static responses, right? We need data. This particular project here utilizes a database called MySQL. That's the technology. The database itself is a MySQL database. So I've connected everything. I'm not going to go through the connection information and stuff like that because that's not super important. But what is important is that in order to manage our data, we're going to utilize an ORM called Entity Framework. Okay, and Entity Framework is basically going to manage our connection and our interactions with the database. So the same sort of things apply to SQLite. The same sort of things apply to other databases like Postgres and stuff like that. I will note that as of this recording, I am not sure if MongoDB is connectable through .NET Core right now. So that's something to note. I haven't tried it myself, to be honest, but my understanding is that is something that is slightly tricky to do in .NET Core. Is it impossible? I'm going to say no, but you may not be able to use the base entity framework to do that. Now, I know this application works with a MySQL database, but again, it's a SQL database, so it works just like SQLite. Just in case you've done some stuff with SQLite, you've ran through some of that in the curriculum, in the lessons. The same sort of things apply. Okay, so right now I'm using a local connection. Okay, to connect to MySQLite. All right, or I'm sorry, MySQL. I'm using a local MySQL instance, just like you would use a local SQLite. There's some differences there. I'm not going to go into it, but basically, we're gonna set up Entity Framework. And the very first thing we have to do with Entity Framework, and yes, you can use the command line and the command line utility that comes with the .NET stuff and the entity command line, right? Entity Framework command line, that kind of thing, to set some of this stuff up for you. But I'm not concerned about that today as much as I'm concerned about making sure you understand what all of this does, right? So the very first thing that needs to happen with all of this is we need what's called a context, okay? And this entity context is kind of where the juicy stuff happens, okay? The really good stuff happens here. This is not where the connection happens, and we'll go over that in a second, but this is where you kind of help define some of the things. Now, the interesting thing about Entity Framework that you should know is there's a couple of different ways to accomplish the same things, okay? The way I'm doing it here, I'm actually defining some properties of the data inside of the entity context, and then that entity context is being used inside of my models to kind of help with that. And in turn, the entity context is being used in the controllers. Okay, and we'll go over that here in a second. But the important part is that I have this model builder .entity. Okay. And basically what this is doing is this is setting up some of my data, okay? And we'll go over the model here in a second, just like a couple of other things. But we're basically saying, entity has key. That's making sure that when we create a new entity, it has that available, and that's defined on our model. And then we have this entity.property, and then we're saying this property is required. So this has key deals with the primary key of your data, okay? So I'm saying my primary key is ID, okay? And I'm saying my data also has a property of URL that is required. And just for some context, this image model that we're using is literally just an ID and a URL for the image, okay? So nothing really super fancy there. It's literally just an ID and a URL. That's a string. So how does this look? How does this look as far as a model? Well, if we go over here and we open up our model, this is literally it, okay? So up here, I'm defining the actual table name. Naming conventions can be handled by Entity Framework, but in my particular data, I have the table is named different than what Entity Framework thinks it should be. So I have this annotation up here to kind of define what the table name should be. You can do the same thing inside of your context. So I could go over here and apply the same thing over here if I wanted to. But the important part is we have a model that's working, that's kind of being managed by this context. So the context is kind of like a a one-stop shop for the management of how your data kind of is put together. Now, the other important part about the entity context, okay, and you can name this whatever you like. It doesn't have to be entity context. It can be, data context, or, app context, or, the name of your app with context on the end or something. It doesn't have to be named entity context. I just named it entity context because it made sense to me. If something else makes sense to you, then you can name it what makes sense. But the key here is that the entity context is kind of where you put all of your models. Okay, your models come together here, and this is where you can like set up relationships and associations. If you want to be super nerdy about it, you can set up your foreign keys and one-to-manys and many-to-manys in here. And that's a little bit beyond the context of this workshop. And trust me, it can be a little bit messy no matter what language or framework you're using. But this is where, if you were using .NET Core MVC with Entity Framework, this is where in Entity Framework you would kind of set up those associations. But back to the model, okay? The model here is a really, really simple model. And notice that I'm putting this on the namespace models, okay? That's fine. You can name it models or some other namespace, but all of your models should be on a namespace and all of your controllers should be on a namespace. That's typically how we organize those files. So you have a controller's namespace, a models namespace, and sometimes you have a view models namespace or something like that. So we're not going to go over that today. But as far as this model is concerned, all we have is an ID, that's an int, and a string, that's a URL. Notice I'm not annotating these at all. You could annotate these with like a primary key, I believe, and stuff like that, but I'm actually taking care of that over in the context. So I might be mixing methods here, but that's okay. It works. It gets us somewhere, right? So, but notice the table annotation again. That is simply telling Entity Framework, hey, the table you're going to be trying to get and set this data inside is called image. I believe Entity Framework would pluralize it, so it would probably want to be images. And this just comes from I already had data, so I'm not doing a code first approach, as they say in this case. I'm doing a data first. So I had my data, and I'm making my models represent that rather than my models structuring my data, right? So my data structures my models, or my models structure my data. So data first or code first. So so that's pretty important. Now, the context here, again, just a reminder, this is where kind of we're putting together some properties and definitions for some of our data. The next thing I want to go over, though, is something really important in our setup here. So over here, so I have my really secure localhost server, root. But let me see here. It's somewhere. Okay, so it's not in here. Okay, never mind. Had a train of thought and I lost it. So sorry about that. It's not important anyway. So I was basically going to show you guys how to prevent your database from like getting recreated, but now that I think about it, I don't think Entity Framework does that. So we're okay there. Anyway, I digress. Now, where do I actually connect to my database, right? Like, where is that connection information in a C# project? Well, it's going to be in this old startup right here. So there's lots of stuff in here. You can ignore 90% of it, 99% of it, somewhere around there. This is what is important. So services.add DB context, entity context, okay? And then you're going to have options. And just like in JavaScript, I can have like a little arrow lambda function thingy, okay? And then I do options, use MySQL. Now, when it's SQLite, this will be a little bit different, right? But I do configuration, connection strings, default, okay? So My headphones turned off. So the connection strings default just refers to, in my application settings, I have my connection strings default. So that's pulling my connection string from there and allowing the MySQL connector to use that connection string. So when you deploy it, there's some different things going on there. Okay, there's a different connection string. I have a hosted database running the same sort of things, but again, a little bit beyond the scope of this one. But that's where you would look if you're trying to figure out, you know, where exactly do I set up this connection string stuff. So it'll be in startup, and usually it'll be in app settings.json or app settings.development.json. I had those two, but you know, creating a project from the command line tools, you know, you may get one or the other or something like that. So, but you'll want to look in your app settings.json somewhere, and your startup.cs. Okay, so you want to check all your app settings .whatever.jsons and your startup, and kind of go from there. So, but that's where the connection information is going. So I'm kind of jumping around here. Let's just go through the flow here. So basically, you create models. Okay. So, and your models can be really simple. They don't have to be anything crazy. It depends on your data and what you need connected. And then you manage all the models inside the entity, the context. Okay, we call it the context, the data context, the DB context, whatever you want to call it. Technically, it derives from the DB context base class, so we can call it DB context. And if you had more than one model, you'd have them set here. So if you had like a users model and an images model, you'd have images, and then right below there, you'd have public DB set, you know, users, you know, get set kind of thing. And then down here is where you set up your kind of requirements, okay, for each property, and your primary keys, any sort of associations, relationships, foreign keys, those kind of things you'd set up down here. Okay, I found the easiest way to set them up is down here. So, and again, it should be noted that the C# curriculum does go through some of this too. So outside the context of this workshop, you know, there'll be other ways to kind of do this, but this is the base way how you do it. So you have a model, you have an entity context, and then something we haven't talked about since the beginning of the workshop here is your controller. Okay, so and typically every model has a controller. So you create a model, you set up, you add it to your entity, your DB context, and then you make a controller, okay? And your controller, again, is your routing and sort of business logic. So in this case, it's a very simple model that doesn't really do very much, but I'm sorry, a controller. Well, both, right? So the model and controller in this case are kind of not super crazy. But the way we're doing it this time is we have this route annotation up here. So that route annotation is basically how we can set up the base route for every route handled in this class, okay, in this controller, okay, if you will. In this case, we're setting up a route where it's API / and then the controller name, okay? So, and it's going to take anything in front of the controller name here. So it's going to be blah controller. And that blah part is what gets replaced in this controller part right here. So this is going to be /API /image, okay? Now, the major difference between the home controller and the image controller is going to be the use of the entity context to manage data, okay? So this entity context, we're saying private read only, okay? So this, so typically that's what your context is as far as access is concerned. It's private read only, okay? Then we provide a constructor, and we're basically saying, hey, _context is equal to the entity context that's being passed in, okay? And the reason we need this is when the .NET Core stuff behind the scenes starts managing, using these classes, it's going to create an image controller class and pass it a entity context to use. So the idea here is the entity context is created as what we call a singleton. Now, a singleton is basically a concept in programming where you only have one instance. So if you think about a component in React or Angular, sorry, brain fart there. Each component can really be created multiple times, right? Like if I create a component in React, I can put it in a loop and create something. I can create one instance of that component. If you think about programming foundations, right? So I can create a constructor and then create multiple versions of multiple instances of like a car or something like that, right? So and classes are part of that, right? So if I create a class, that's a template for an instance. Where a singleton is different, is a singleton actually is one instance. And that's what our entity context is. It's a singleton. There's only one instance throughout our whole application. And we don't want to be creating new instances of entity context. We have to have a very good reason to do that. And usually we don't have a good reason to do that. So that's why we need the constructor on image controller, because the constructor is called when a instance of our controller is created. And when the .NET MVC stuff creates that instance, it passes in an entity context. It passes in the entity context singleton, okay? And then inside of here, we set up underscore context is equal to the context singleton. So this allows us to use the singleton context that's created by Entity Framework, okay? And it allows us to access data and access our models, okay? And the method below the constructor shows us how to do this, okay? So on this one, this is our Git, okay, method, all right? And basically we have HTTP Git, okay? That says, hey, this is a Git route, all right? And we don't define, unlike the home controller, we don't define a specific route. And that means that it'll be a GET request that should target API /API/image, okay? Because this controller part is replaced with image from our name, okay? So if we changed the name of the controller, this would change, okay? That's an important part. If we name, it's based on the name of the controller this time, okay? So, and that's because we have this little controller placeholder here, okay? But I digress a bit here. So HTTP GET, all right? So when we do a GET request for /API/image, okay, do this, all right? And this time around, our method is a JSON result return, okay? So we're returning some JSON, okay, as our response. And again, get data, we can call that whatever we want. We can change the name. It doesn't matter what this is named. And then inside of the method, we return JSON, okay? We just have that available to us. Underscore context dot images, okay? So notice there's no serialization in the changing of hands that we do personally. We can just give it the images collection from the context, okay? And it will just convert that to some JSON, okay? And that just happens automatically. Like Entity Framework and .NET MVC, .NET Core, all of that, it's handling that for us. We can literally say exactly what we want without having to worry about the conversion process. So we're basically saying, hey, the images, all of the images that I have in my database, just pass those along. Now, of course, in the real world, you might have some filters and stuff like that, but the key here is that we're using the context that has access to the image model, and that manages the in-between between the database and our controller. We're utilizing that to get data that we want, okay? Now, I can talk until I'm blue in the face, and I probably will, but the key here is that all of this should congeal together to give us access to our data. Okay. So again, we get hello from .NET Core, but if we go to /API/image, okay, I've already gone to it, of course. It's going to grab some data from the database. Now, again, the data is inconsequential here. The database we're connecting to and the data we're getting is not important. The important part is that we've connected all these pieces to make it just a few lines of code to get our data. So we're using Entity Framework as our ORM, okay, our object relational mapping or object relational model, whichever you prefer. And we're using that so we don't have to write queries. We don't have to mess around with figuring out how we're going to get the data. We're just saying, hey, here's how our data is structured, and here's what I want. Inside of my controller, I'm going, here's what I want. And just through the magic of ORMs and .NET, .NET MVC, we can easily make that happen through HTTP requests, okay? So that's the basics of how it all plays together. So in review, you have your image, okay? Your image, which is a model, your entity context, which is kind of the repository of these models, okay? And the entity context is kind of what you use in your controller to retrieve and set data and stuff like that, okay? So those are the three pieces you really need to get a data-driven API working in .NET Core MVC using Entity Framework. I know that's a big, long description, right? But it's really not that bad once you get down to it, right? So there's only a couple of lines of code we have to kind of keep track of. And as long as you have, a model and a controller with an entity, with a DB context, I keep saying entity context, but really it's a DB context, right? So as long as you have a model and a controller with the DB context in between them, you can really start to get stuff. There's one caveat to this. I don't have an example privy right just now, but one caveat to this is authentication. And also relationships. So both of those will be times where you might have multiple models for one controller or multiple models kind of congealed together as one kind of piece. And those can get really tangled and complicated. And, this is kind of like the basic C# backend stuff compared to like the really complicated advanced stuff. So maybe another time, but just keep in mind, there are cases where this kind of gets thrown up in the air and flipped on itself. But the basics of, a really simple, .NET Core MVC kind of thing with Entity Framework as the ORM, this is how it connects. So, but I'm going to actually open it up for questions right now. Are there any questions from the gallery here? And just keep in mind, everyone's muted right now, so you might need to unmute if you want to ask a question. Feel free to slap in the Zoom chat if you want as well. Okay, well, if there's no questions, I'll probably adjourn the workshop here. Quick little workshop running through C#, .NET Core API backend kind of thing. Just again, keep in mind this workshop is more about defining the pieces. Tracy, did you have a question real quick? I saw you went off mute there.
No, just when we were going to adjourn, I just wanted to tell you I thought you did a great job and thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Well, sorry, I put you on the spot there.
That's okay.
You're forever in the recording now. But thank you. But if there's no questions, we can adjourn. I just wanted to take a couple minutes and go through like the basic pieces of what you'll need. Like I said, the code itself is not really super crazy. It's more of like the concepts of like getting everything to work together, right? So, but anyway, definitely thank you everyone who stopped by to be part of the workshop tonight. Thank you if you're watching this offline and some other time. Thank you for joining me. Hopefully this helped kind of bridge some gaps in knowledge and concepts, and I will see you guys at the next workshop tomorrow.